What if I told you that some of your favorite UFC fighters, champions, legends are struggling to pay their bills? That behind the fame and highlight reel knockouts, there's a dark reality no one talks about? Fighters risking their lives for your entertainment. Yet they're fighting not just in the octagon, but against the UFC itself for fair pay. This isn't just a problem, it's a full-blown controversy. And today we're exposing it all. Before we break down all the shocking details, make sure to subscribe for more raw, unfiltered UFC content. Stay ahead of all the fight drama, controversies, and breaking news. Let's start with the truth. UFC fighters make way less than you think. The UFC generates billions, yet fighters only receive about 16 to 20% of revenue. Compare that to other sports like the NBA, where players get nearly 50%. Think about it, these guys put their bodies on the line, risk brain damage, and can't even negotiate proper contracts. Take Francis Ngannou, for example. The former UFC heavyweight champion, one of the scariest men on the planet, was fighting for $600,000 per match while the UFC was making millions off him. He walked away from the UFC not because he was scared of Jon Jones, but because he was tired of being underpaid. And he's not alone. Sean Strickland, Al Iaquinta, Jon Jones, Nate Diaz, and even Jorge Masvidal have all spoken out about fighter pay. But here's the real kicker. Some fighters are making less than $12,000 per fight. And if they lose, that number gets cut in half. After training expenses, coaches' fees, and taxes, many of them are left broke. And the worst part? They can't do anything about it. How UFC contracts trap fighters. Here's something the UFC doesn't want you to know. Fighters are locked into contracts that give them zero control over their careers. Let's talk about the Champions Clause. If a fighter wins a belt, their contract automatically extends, even if they want to leave. Fighters don't have the freedom to negotiate better deals with other promotions like boxing or PFL. Think about it, if Conor McGregor wanted to box full-time or go to a different promotion, the UFC could legally block him unless they get a massive cut. And it gets worse. The UFC can cut fighters at any time, but fighters can't leave whenever they want. If they speak out too much, they might never get a title shot or even get benched for months without a fight. This isn't just a business, it's control. Now, you might be thinking, why don't more fighters just expose the UFC? Because Dana White doesn't play games. When Jon Jones demanded more money for a super fight with Ngannou, Dana publicly embarrassed him, saying he was scared to fight. When Jorge Masvidal asked for a pay raise, Dana told him to go fight somewhere else. And remember Leslie Smith? She tried to start a fighters union, and suddenly, she was cut from the UFC. Fighters know that if they talk too much, they might lose their careers. How the UFC protects itself, the monopoly problem. You might be thinking, why don't fighters just leave and fight somewhere else? Because the UFC is basically a monopoly. In boxing, fighters have multiple organizations to negotiate with. But in MMA, the UFC controls everything. Sure, there's Bellator, PFL, and one championship, but let's be honest. None of them have the star power, marketing, or pay-per-view reach of the UFC. Even if a fighter wants to leave, there's nowhere that offers the same level of fame and sponsorship opportunities. And Dana White knows that. This is why the UFC can pay fighters less while making billions, because they have no real competition. Will fighter pay ever change? So, will things ever change? Well, Jake Paul and PFL have been calling out the UFC and offering better pay for fighters. Francis Ngannou's PFL deal guarantees him millions per fight, something the UFC never gave him. More fighters are getting vocal, and with big names like Ngannou, Jake Paul, and even boxing crossovers becoming more common, the pressure is on the UFC to start paying fighters more. But unless more top fighters unite and demand change, Dana White isn't budging. Here's the reality, the UFC is the biggest and most prestigious MMA organization in the world. But at what cost? Fighters sacrifice their bodies, risk brain damage, and put on wars for fans only to walk away underpaid and financially struggling. And as long as the UFC holds all the power, nothing is changing anytime soon. Now, I want to hear from you. Do you think the UFC should pay fighters more? Or is it just part of the business? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more inside stories on UFC drama, fighter controversies, and everything Dana White doesn't want you to know, hit that subscribe button and become part of this fight community. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Let's take a step back and ask, why does the UFC get away with paying fighters so little? Because at the end of the day, the UFC isn't just a fight promotion, it's a business empire. While fighters are focused on training, cutting weight, and surviving wars in the cage, the UFC is focused on one thing, profits. And that's exactly why they keep fighter pay low. Less money for fighters equals more money for the UFC. They don't want fighters to have power. They want them to need the UFC, depend on the UFC, and be afraid to leave. And if you think I'm exaggerating, let's look at how the UFC actually makes money. The UFC's real money machine and why fighters get left behind. A lot of people think the UFC makes its money just from pay-per-views, but that's only part of the picture. The real money comes from TV deals, sponsorships, and licensing agreements. In 2018, the UFC signed a $1.5 billion deal with ESPN for exclusive rights. That means whether a UFC event sells 1 million PPVs or not, the UFC is making guaranteed money. Then you have sponsors. Companies like Monster Energy, Crypto.com, and Venom are paying millions to the UFC. But here's the catch: fighters don't see any of that money. Before the UFC signed its Reebok and now Venom sponsorship deals, fighters used to have personal sponsors on their fight shorts. Some fighters made hundreds of thousands per fight just from sponsorships. But now, fighters are forced to wear UFC-approved gear, and the UFC takes the majority of the sponsorship money. The UFC has created a system where they control everything: TV deals, sponsorships, PPVs, merchandise, even fighters' social media restrictions. Fighters? They're just part of the machine. Despite the UFC's control, there have been fighters who stood up and walked away. Francis Ngannou left the UFC for PFL, got full contract control and millions per fight. Eddie Alvarez left for one championship, got away bigger deal. Demetrius Mighty Mouse Johnson, arguably the greatest flyweight ever, left the UFC after being treated unfairly and is now thriving in one. These guys realized something: UFC doesn't own them. But here's the problem: not everyone has that option. Most fighters aren't big enough names to negotiate massive contracts. If they leave, they disappear into smaller promotions with fewer eyes and smaller paychecks. That's why most fighters stay and put up with it. Think about guys like Sean O'Malley or Khamzat Chimaev, fighters the UFC is pushing as the next big superstars. These guys are marketable, exciting, and undefeated or close to it. The UFC makes them stars because they know they'll make the company millions. But what happens when these same fighters ask for more money? Look at Jon Jones. For years, he was the biggest star in the UFC. But the moment he demanded more money for a super fight with Francis Ngannou, Dana White publicly humiliated him, called him scared, and refused to pay him. Jones had to sit out for 3 years before finally getting what he wanted. Even the biggest names in the sport don't have control. If that's the case for Jon Jones, imagine what it's like for the guys making $12,000 per fight. The UFC's future: can fighter pay ever change? The biggest question is, will things ever get better? Right now, it doesn't look like it. The UFC is making more money than ever. Dana White is not interested in paying fighters more. Fighters are too scared to unionize. Unless there's a major shift, like fighters coming together, a new MMA organization rising, or a lawsuit forcing the UFC's hand, this problem isn't going away. But one thing is certain: fighters are speaking up more than ever. And the more fans demand better fighter treatment, the harder it will be for the UFC to ignore the issue. Some fans argue, who cares? Fighters sign the contract, they know what they're getting into. But think about this: without fighters, there's no UFC. These guys put their bodies on the line for our entertainment. They suffer brain damage, career-ending injuries, and permanent damage, and many of them walk away with almost nothing. This isn't just about money, it's about respecting the warriors who make the sport what it is. So now, I ask you, do you think the UFC should start paying fighters more, or is this just business as usual? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you love inside stories like this, subscribe right now. This is the fight community you need to be a part of. Thanks for watching, see you in the next one.